So I'm going to digress a little before I even get started here. Be careful how I say this here. So after this particular weekend at Prairie Festival and after this particular week in the life of our country, I am filled with gratitude for the women in the life, in my own life, and in the life of the Land Institute as an organization. If we didn't have the brain power, yeah. If we didn't have the brain power, the willpower, the grace, I wouldn't be even half of who I am. This organization wouldn't be even half of what it is. And I was last night, my daughter's 3, and last night as the band was playing, she was spinning and twirling around here, and I think sometimes at times like this of some of the things that I'm going to have to explain to her, as she gets older. And I want to talk to the men for just a second here. Let's whittle that list down here, okay? Let's whittle that list down, because I don't want to have to explain as much as I have to explain. It's digression number 1. Digression number 2, I want to echo Rachel's thanks to the staff here. I want to thank Rachel, who has moved this thing right along with grace. And I want to thank somebody whose face you haven't seen much, our Director of Administration, Chris Pembleton. No, it's somebody else, I think. But Chris is the air traffic controller on all this. He's kept this ship running smoothly. And, Chris gets things done without ticking people off, which is a rare gift. So appreciate all the staff here. And then digression number 3, I have a quick announcement to make about the bookstore. We've had several of our titles have gone like hotcakes, and those resources have been depleted to zero. But I'm happy to say that Stan Cox's book on rationing has been purchased with measured prudence, and therefore we still have copies available, which somehow seems appropriate to me. Okay. Paperclip is coming off here. So we put our camp on the riverbank, and we put in over 100 million feet, the whole cut coming off of 140. That 40 was built almost like an Egyptian pyramid, a hill, and the timber grew clear to the peak on all 4 sides. I guess it was kind of vertical farming, Stan, if you're around here. The river broke up early that spring, running black and high, and all hands went on the drive. We didn't truly know the country, but Bunyan, he was sure we'd hit one mill or another downstream, and he didn't give a hoot which one, because logs were the same price everywhere. Well, we ran that drive for 4 weeks, making about a mile a day, when we passed another camp that had lumbered big and gone on the drive. Just about as big as us, it looked like. Matter of fact, they'd been cutting a steep hill 42. Well, we drove on another month, hit another camp, and another hill 40. And Bunyan starts to swear because he sees the price of logs sinking down with all this lumbering going on. 4 more weeks, and we hit another hill 40, and well, that's when we knew it was Round River. That's one of the large catalog of Paul Bunyan stories that are out there that Aldo Leopold extracts in about 2 sentences at the start of his essay, Round River, about falling into circular patterns, returning to the place of origin intentionally or not. I've extracted the story down from about 3 or 4 pages, so you might want to Google it and check it out. But let me go straight then to Aldo Leopold's words from this same essay where he invokes the Paul Bunyan story, Round River. We of the genus Homo ride the logs which float down the round river, and by a little judicious burling, we've learned to guide their direction and speed. This feat entitles us to the specific appellation sapiens. This technique of burling, which of course you know is log rolling, literally, is called economics. The remembering of old routes is called history. The selection of new ones is called statesmanship. The conversation about oncoming riffles and rapids is called politics. Some of the crew aspire to burl not only their own logs, but the whole flotilla as well. So then Leopold goes on after he makes this kind of wry commentary about our Paul Bunyan economy. He goes on to make his main point of the essay about ecological processes. And he writes, so Wisconsin didn't just have a round river that flowed back on itself in a circle. Wisconsin is a round river. The current is the stream of energy which flows out of the soil into plants, thence into animals, and thence back into the soil in a never-ending circuit of life. So Leopold highlights energy here, but of course the same applies to nutrients, to carbon, to even genetic flows and genetic diversity. So all of these are examples of how ecosystems and the ecosphere are beautifully circular. Circular in the sense of an unbroken circle, a perfect circle, or a virtuous circle. Now our economic systems, in contrast, tend to be perversely circular. Circular in the sense of circular logic, circular firing squads, and a vicious circle. And this is reflected by our fuzziness at times about what economic ends we seek, and our fuzziness about the means we choose to pursue them. Like Paul Bunyan's crew fruitlessly driving logs in a circle month after month, the process takes over. The objective of our agriculture is for people to be fed, but the abstract concept of wealth creation in a laissez-faire economy has become the product, and farmers and eaters both fall by the wayside. The objective of having things like houses, like clothing, is for people to be sheltered from the elements, but instead something like a consumer products arms race dominates instead. And so we burn daylight, fossil daylight, while the planet warms. The perverse circularity of the economy ignores or subverts the beautiful circularity of the ecosphere. So the confluence of these two confusions, confusion about ends and confusion about means, is exemplified by our obsessive focus on one leading economic indicator, gross domestic product, which of course is the market value of all the goods and services produced in a particular country. The precursor measure to that was gross national product, and that came out of the Great Depression. FDR's brain trust needed an expedient way to compare year over year how they were doing on the climb out from the Great Depression. An economist named Simon Kuznets was the main architect of the gross national product and later GDP metrics. And as early as 1934, he was starting to kind of sound the alarm about misusing it. Kuznets points out that GDP ignores economic activity outside the marketplace, things that are going on the economic margins in the home. It ignores wealth inequalities, differences in distribution of wealth, and it ignores the totality of the human experience of the people involved in creating the wealth. Kuznets writes that, quote, "The welfare of a nation can therefore scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income," end quote. Economist Kate Rayworth translates some of Kuznets' remarks in the same report into the language of systems analysis that we know from recent decades. Rayworth explains that on its own, a measure of national income all by itself is a flow with no accompanying stocks. It's a flow without any stocks that it's flowing from or to. It lacks any accounting for the wealth, financial, ecological, or otherwise, from which that income was extracted, and it lacks any accounting for where the consequences of that extraction accrue. And so I think I'll suggest another term for a flow that's imposed without any regards to stocks, and that is a wound. Lack of stocks on either end. So Kate Raworth, that same economist I just mentioned, UK economist, about 6 years ago, she debuted the Safe and Just Space framework for thinking about our economic life on the planet. A safe existence, according to Raworth, is one that avoids violating any critical planetary boundaries. She was referencing some ecology work out of the Stockholm Resilience Center some years before on planetary boundaries. Boundaries like atmospheric CO2 concentration, like nitrogen and phosphorus cycling, non-renewable resource extraction, those kind of things. That's a safe existence. A just existence is one where the vast majority of the people on the planet attain certain minimum standards of nutrition, health status, access to basic energy, etc. So Raworth takes these two sets of indices and she plots the safety criteria on one round diagram, kind of like a pedal plot, and she plots the justice criteria on another round diagram. And then she stacks one on top of the other. And so she defines a space where she suggests we need to live, where the floor of that space are the minimum justice requirements for a good human existence, and the ceiling are the maximum withdrawals, the maximum impact we can make on the planet without violating boundaries. And the shape that that space makes leads to Raworth's tagline in her popular book from about a year ago, Donut Economics. We have to live in the donut. The floor is what we need to live a good existence. The ceiling around the circle of everything in the economy is what the planet can gracefully withstand. So that concept was out 6 years ago. 6 months ago, a team of researchers, also from England, published an article in the journal Nature Sustainability that was a quantitative assessment of how we're doing at staying in the donut, staying in Raworth's donut. If you have not picked up your copy of Nature Sustainability yet, spoiler alert for anybody here, the conclusion was that our performance is pretty poor so far. Terrible, in fact. For 5 out of 11 well-being indicators that were used, some of those were life satisfaction, health, sanitation. There was not one single country in the whole world that met the minimum while simultaneously not exceeding the maximum of the planetary boundary. For the other 6 indicators, there were only a tiny handful of countries in each case that were able to even pull one of the well-being indicators off without violating boundaries. So in short, it's another affirmation. We're not coming anywhere close to living sustainably and justly on this planet yet. And so a hard implication of that is that the things that we've been trying to do so far, our mainstream approach to reforming this, aren't working. And here's the hard implication. This includes much of the conventional progressive toolbox for how we turn these things around. I'm referring to the suite of efforts that are informed, we're increasingly coming to understand by a paradigm called eco-modernism that depend on reducing the coupling of economic activity with planetary extraction. I'm talking about things like large-scale renewables in the unmodified context of the current energy economy. I'm talking about replacing gas engines with hybrids and electrification. I'm talking about water efficiency, like the proverbial squiggly light bulbs. We need a folksy way to talk about LED light bulbs, because squiggly light bulbs are not really in use here. All these things are good measures, but all of these things take place within and against the backdrop of the growth economy. And so all of them will ultimately prove inadequate. Now, insufficient, if these measures are insufficient, that's not to say that they're unnecessary or that they're ignoble. We say at the Land Institute often, as we contextualize our perennial polycultural agricultural work, that doesn't mean that the best possible farming with annuals, the most conscientious, skillful organic farming, like the folks that Liz is working with, like Practical Farmers of Iowa works with, that's no indictment, not even a tiny bit, of the integrity and the value and the necessity of those things. And the parallel measures that are being taken in other sectors, industrial sustainability, sustainability in commercial sector, all these things are slowing down the rate of resource degradation, of planetary degradation, and they're buying us time to seek a more permanent solution. And so it need not be an indictment of these things to say that we nevertheless have to face that they are hopelessly insufficient in the long run, these decoupling strategies. The economic transformations that we need run farther and deeper and wider. We need, as we've been talking about, nothing less than a transition to an ecological civilization, a reset to an ecological civilization. So what is a civilization? Well, I mean, I guess it's progress here. The story usually goes, boy and girl meet annual grass species. Boy and girl domesticate grass into a grain crop, and they settle down, they urbanize, socially stratify, arts and letters blossom, people-nature dualism flourishes, and they all live happily ever after, or at least until the resources run out. So that's civilization, right? And so an ecological civilization, as distinct from the road that we've been on here, I would propose is distinguished by two criteria, primarily. One of the criteria is that the process of marshaling ends and means to do the things that we need to do, so which is to say our economic actions, that process is deeply ecologically informed in a way that respects planetary boundaries and respects the well-being of our fellow dwellers on the planet. That's at all levels, household, society, whole ecosphere. In other words, we need to live in the donut here. The other criterion is that the impulse for economic actions to be good, ecologically informed, and compassionate needs to be woven directly into the very fabric of our culture and not dependent on individual people maintaining an extremely high success rate of making good decisions every day over the long term. In other words, we need to make it doable for people who aren't saints. I'll thank Aubrey for that turn of phrase there. She was hoping I would cut the preceding sentence and replace it with that smaller one, and instead it was additive, which was almost the opposite, I think, of cutting it back. So what do these things require of us? So we need to have, I have a list of a few things that I'll preface with the statement, we need to have a deep understanding of and a deep reconciliation with the profound changes in our thinking and in our actions that will be necessary. And remember, as we just discussed, this is not something that we drop a couple technological fixes in. We've got to remember that because it'll be easy to forget it every day of this, that we are out to change our paradigm, to change our system. And so the list of, I think, five things that I want to suggest. First, we need an end. There's no easy way to say this. We need an end to global economic growth. Everything that we know about history, everything that we know about biology, everything that we know about Earth system science tells us that economic activities can never be decisively, thoroughly decoupled from impacts on the ecosphere. There will always be some impact, no matter how much we reduce it. That right there is enough to be able to tell that infinite economic growth is a nonsense concept. It doesn't compute. But at this point, just ending economic growth is not going to be enough. We need to start walking it back. We're going to need to tackle some economic degrowth here. If we go back to that same nature sustainability paper I was mentioning about how far we were falling short on the indicators, I said for some of the indicators, there's a token number of countries that are meeting them. And so if you look at the countries that are meeting individual indicators here and there and try to put a narrative, the best narrative we can put together, which is not very great right now, if we were to try to cobble together a hypothetical, sustainable, minimally prosperous country out of this list from just what's been demonstrated now, what we would have is the nutrition pathway of Eritrea, which happens to meet the minimum criteria they used without exceeding many maxima. We'd have a sanitation pathway that nobody has exactly demonstrated yet, but Tajikistan is the closest. We'd have the medium income and energy use pathways of Moldova. We would have a health pathway that hasn't been demonstrated yet either, but Vietnam comes kind of close. We'd have the secondary education attainment pathway of Sri Lanka, the equality pathway of Ethiopia, the full employment pathway of Rwanda. And again, recall, these are all countries that actually are meeting the minima that we're on here. And we would have pathways to democratic governance and to overall life satisfaction that have not yet been demonstrated in any country. Nobody has achieved those without going way over planetary boundaries. So one thing you may have noticed on that list is that there's not much of the global north on that list. The closest thing that the closest anybody's coming to demonstrating this is in a minority, a subset of global south countries. And so as we face here the need that not only do we need degrowth as a planetary civilization, we especially need degrowth here in the wealthy countries so that we can create some slack for our neighbors in the global south to climb out of the colonial trench that they're in on a lot of these indicators now. The sort of the solace that we can take with the global south nature of that list that I just read is that maybe we can learn something from our southern neighbors. They're not hugely far along on this, but they're a little farther along than us on living well within planetary means. Second, continuing in this same vein here, what we'll need to accomplish this degrowth, it was voiced earlier eloquently, we need to develop a sense of sufficiency. Wes sometimes points out that we've evolved as a species to like our num-nums, to like easy, cheap carbon, like the sweets, and we've developed some more complex desires here with our big brains, and we have not evidently faced yet, at least, enough evolutionary selection pressure to start evolving that maladaptive trait out. So we've got to reason our way around it so far. So rather than the consumer arms race that we're in, we need to cultivate a sense of sufficiency, to take pleasure in modest amounts of energy and resource-intensive goods and services, and an overflowing abundance of beautiful relationships with one another and the ecosphere. So sufficiency with the extractive and an abundance of the relational. Third, we need to embed good economic behavior into culture. As I've said, the main platform for this is most likely ethics. There's a passage that's basically part of our liturgy here that you all know. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. The word of Leopold for the people of Leopold. Thanks. No, has anybody been to church? Yes, there we go. Thanks be to Leopold. Thank you. So Leopold was writing, you guys, we're keeping you away from church, aren't we here? So Leopold was writing in 1947, but we can go back further than that here. I referenced an economic historian, Dotan Lesham, yesterday, who writes again about ancient Greece, that the concept of oikonomia for the ancient Greeks and the concept of modern economics study human behavior as a relationship between ends and means. Contemporary economics is largely neutral regarding the choice between ends. We know that. While in ancient economic theory, in ancient Greece at least, an action is considered economically rational only when taken toward a praiseworthy end. Praiseworthy ends include careful stewardship of the family, the household, the farm, contributions to public institutions, support for friends and neighbors of more limited means, and the creation of leisure time in which to contribute to good governance and to arts and letters. Time for milling about. I think maybe it was Karen that said that. Unpraiseworthy ends, in contrast, include self-aggrandizement, excessive luxuries, and poor stewardship of the household. A related concept in the economic writings of the ancient Greek philosophers is that oikonomia, or economics, referred only to the careful stewardship of practical matters. They had a word for pursuing wealth for wealth's own sake, and they gave it a different word than economics. It was chrematistics, the art of acquiring wealth. They partitioned it off to try to keep it out of the main proposition. And so indiscriminately plowing wealth back in to create more wealth was something that at their best, at the heights of their writing about what they aspired to at least, that the ancient Greeks were unfamiliar with. And so you might say, for this lack of emphasis on plowing it back in, that they had a no-till economics, at least what they aspired to. Fourth, we need to make cooperation a fundamental building block of economic activity. That's been eloquently stated by several of our speakers, and so I'll simply say for our purposes here that while we have the conceit at times that we are, red of tooth and claw, and that it's a battle between self-interested actors, that's certainly not where we've been evolutionarily as a species through most of our history, and it's certainly not what we see bubble out when the chips are down, times of disaster, times when compassion comes out. It's certainly not what we see demonstrated at the grassroots. So we know that we're equipped to live cooperatively and to express that, among other things, in things like cooperatives, things like the commons. Fifth, final numbered point here, we have to figure out who makes decisions and how the decisions are made. We know that our current concept of democracy, that we can articulate many alternatives that our current democracy is vastly better than, right? I mean, it's better than authoritarianism. I mean, that's clear. But is that good enough? Is being better than authoritarianism good enough? Is it the best that we can do? Loka Ashwood, she's still here or not, challenged us on this score earlier. The writing of James Scott challenges us on this. They question whether majority rule democracy, as we currently conceive of it, is capable of truly respecting minority rights and therefore truly kind of optimizing wise and just outcomes. I don't have any answers for you on that, but I have that flagged for myself as a particularly important question as we figure this out. And so these thoughts about governance go right along with I think what we know, that these what Loka calls these rule of numbers perspectives, or perspectives founded on utilitarianism, or what James Scott calls a little bit separately the high modernist project, where we're making big, grandiose interventions that originate from a central locus of power far away and are going to clean everything up in one fell swoop. We need to be a little skeptical of those too. And so that further implies, that brings us to this topic of localism and localization. And I'll let Liz's words on that stand. She expressed very well that we know that we have to localize our culture and our economy and we know that it's not a panacea. We have to think our way through that too. So how do we make this transition? How do we get from the point we are now to this very distant point where we know that we need to end in terms of our economic sensibilities and our economic systems? We know that there's a handful of problems that we can solve with our current process of civil society engagement and democratic governance, a tiny handful, it seems like sometimes. We know that we can organize at the grassroots to help vision out the future that we want better than it's being visioned in this sort of high modernist way. And we can have some successes with that in the short term by engaging our current political system better through the grassroots. Some successes will have to wait until we can create a whole better paradigm and kind of launch it out into the world. Either way, this intensely locally relational process of friendships, of conversations with each other is the starting point for visioning the future that we want and for building the capacity, the interpersonal capacity to go out and get it. I wrote something else down from Karen here. How can I move forward from the strength of the community to sit with the discomfort and move into joy? I think that happens relationally at the local level. So here, as I close, I'm going to indulge in a more or less un-agrarian metaphor here. It involves space travel. Any of you who are close readers of your land report will know that this is my second offense in 1 year on this, but it relates to the circularities, the good and bad circularities I was talking about. So when a spacecraft is traveling from one place to another between the Earth and the Moon, say, you do it not in a straight line, but by modifying the orbit that you're in. You take on an elliptical orbit that gets you farther away from where you're starting out and closer to where you're going. When you get close to your destination, you have to recircularize your orbit. And so what you do at that point is that you fire your rocket motors at that point and do what's called a circularization burn in the jargon. And so that is ruinously expensive in terms of your very scarce fuel resources, right? But you do it with the understanding that if you do it just the right amount, at just the right time, it'll move you into a new orbit, which you will be maintained in for free by physics, by the physical forces underlying the universe. Kate Rayworth writes in Donut Economics, ours is the first generation to deeply understand the damage we have been doing to our planetary household, and probably the last generation with the chance to do something transformative about it. So as a civilization, we have the opportunity now, and maybe our only remaining opportunity, to perform a civilizational circularization burn. We think about that a lot at the Land Institute as we use technologies and equipment and facilities that are made possible only by cheap fossil fuels and by the high modernist project to develop crops that will scarcely depend on fossil fuels, that will depend on creatureliness and intact ecological functioning. And so maybe the same logic applies to some of our economic thought and our thought experiments here, that we need to get cracking now while we still have a lot of ability, a lot of energetic slack to come to meetings, to wing thoughts wirelessly around the globe. Maybe we need to get cracking now while we have a little bit of slack to get this done. So understand that changes will be necessary, big changes. One of those will be that we need to end the growth economy. To do that, we need to cultivate a sense of sufficiency. We need good economic decisions baked into our culture through ethics. We need to cooperate with each other, and we need to make decisions in a just and appropriately scaled manner. And so if we can perform this circularization, if we can get out of the perverse circularity of current economics, of our hunger for fulfillment, of our great wealth and great deprivation, of our failing planet, maybe we can craft for ourselves an economic circularity that mimics and interlocks with the elegant dynamic circularity of nature, with the stream of energy which flows out of the soil into plants, thence into animals, thence back into the soils in a never-ending circuit of life. Maybe we can at last reconcile our ecology and our economics. Maybe at last the story of our life in this place can guide the stewardship of our life in this place. Prairie roots and human roots intertwined. Thank you for being here. Yeah.